Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Denise. And on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, we thank you and the Washington Informer for having these programs, informing our community. And your recognition of Earth Day, Earth Month is quite appropriate given the disparities and given the disproportionate exposure that African Americans and other people of color continue to have as a result of poor environmental policy. I would say some systemic racism in the environmental field. And now that we're dealing with climate change, I'm glad that the United States has rejoined the Paris Accords and has also rejoined the WHO, the World Health Organization, because there's an intersection, Denise, between climate and health. There's an intersection between the social determinatives of health. The CDC this week announced that racism is now a public health crisis in America.
Exactly. Now, the Washington Post, and I'm glad to mention that, went back quite a ways to do a story with you and a situation in North Carolina,
Yes.
in which some folks were concerned about in the area. Tell us about that story. I just want you to fill
Thank you. It
us
was
in
in
on that.
1982. There are 100 counties in North Carolina, and the most predominant Black county in North Carolina is Warren County. That's where Floyd McKissick attempted to build Soul City. Warren County is a poor community, but also agriculture. And the agricultural level is very shallow. That means people to get their well water, the water level is very shallow. So that's the last place you want to dig a landfill. But the state of North Carolina dug a big hole in the middle of a Black community, and they were going to dump 40 tons of PCB, polychlorinated biphenyl, cancer-causing substance. And of course, this is in 1982. The Wilmington 10, we had just had our convictions overturned in 1980. The last thing I wanted to be was arrested again in North Carolina.
I can imagine.
Duty called, so the United Church of Christ sent me back to Warren County, North Carolina, to lead the protests against these PCBs. And sure enough, I was arrested, along with 500 other people, Reverend Joseph Lowry, Walter Fontroy, Reverend Leon White, there were Dollar Barrow. 500 people were arrested, including myself. So I was in the Warren County jail, and I said, you know what, this is racism, but this is environmental racism. I kind of conceived the term while I was in jail, but I gave it further definition upon reflection. And then in 1986, 87, we published, that is the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. By that time, I was the CEO of that organization. We published the first national study on toxic waste and race in America that showed that race was the most determinative factor in the location of toxic waste facilities in the United States. In all 50 states, in all zip codes, we ran a statistical verifiable test. So that's why I coined the term environmental racism, which simply means that there's racial discrimination in environmental policymaking. Environmental racism is the deliberate targeting of people of color communities for these cancer-causing facilities and pollutants. Cancer Alley between Baton Rouge and New Orleans in Louisiana, where 90% of the residents in Cancer Alley have cancer. That's because they're living in proximity of these polluting cancer-causing energy plants. So that's sort of the background of how what happened in Warren County in 1982 now is grown to a national and global movement. It's called the Environmental Justice Movement, the EJ movement, environmental justice. And there are many environmental justice activists now all over the United States, African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islanders, and it's a global movement now. The United Nations now has a whole committee dealing with environmental justice.
One of the things that when we started doing these sustainability issues was to bring the issue to the community, particularly, I want to say, I guess I'll say poor people, folks who, and rich alike. I mean, it doesn't matter, I guess, economic status, because we're all impacted by the environment. But when you look at places like Flint, Michigan, and other places, like you said, Warren County and other places around the country, it's always seems to be the places where Black and brown people live and the children are impacted by that as well.
Yes.
Is there any, has the NNPA gotten itself or looking at this issue as well? What are Black newspapers doing across the country to actually get the word out? Or have there been any partnerships that have been established to make sure that Black communities are included in this whole environmental movement?
That's a great question. And now that we have a young African-American secretary of the EPA, he's from North Carolina also, I think that's a great thing. We should establish those partnerships. I think some of our local NNPA member newspaper publishers are carrying the issue of environmental justice. I know the North Carolina newspapers are definitely on it. Some in Louisiana, I know Terry Jones of the Data newspaper in New Orleans is on it, and Houston, a major, most of our Houston papers, and some California papers also. So the answer is yes, we are covering the issue, but I do think it's a great opportunity to form some of the partnerships that you mentioned with some of the state environmental agencies as well as the federal EPA.
Right. We have so many places. We mentioned Houston and the flooding that's happened down there repeatedly. And I know that's impacted some of our newspapers there, and the storms, yes, and all the things that environmental things that are happening all over the country that are weather related, but we don't always connect them to the environment. And I know that we cover those types of stories as well. I'm glad to have a little bit of your time, and I know that you're going to have to run because you've been busy, I think, doing quite a bit today. But I wanted to see if I could get some comments from you as it relates to the verdict in the Derek Chauvin case this week.
Well, I think that the jury did the right thing by bringing back a guilty verdict on all three charges. But I also want to give the Honorable Keith Ellison a lot of credit. He's the African-American Attorney General of Minnesota. When he left his congressional seat, a lot of people said, man, why are you leaving the CBC to run for a statewide office in Minnesota? He did the right thing, because it hadn't been for him driving, putting that prosecutorial team together, I doubt if we would have gotten those guilty verdicts. And you saw how confident Shevry was even doing the trial, didn't show any remorse. Even when he was the guilty verdicts, they put the handcuffs on him and let him out. So I think it's a step in the right direction, Denise, but I think we have to keep stepping, because even while the jury verdict was being announced, other shootings take place. In Columbus, Ohio, shootings in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and other parts of the country. So this systemic racism problem with policing. And that's why there's a call now, urgent call, for the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And we're hoping that the Senate or the House has already passed it. And I think there's a lot now on the Senate's agenda. And I also was glad to see that the House passed the DC statehood bill.
Yeah.
So, and of course, if we can get statehood for DC, that means there's 2 more senators.
Right.
And we can break this blockage in the United States Senate. So there's a lot at stake, Denise. And I think that people should be encouraged to continue to raise our voices. I'm going to shout out to the Honorable Maxine Waters, who was outspoken and telling people to keep demonstrating. And I know a lot of people came down on Maxine, but she was right. We would not have had that verdict if people had not raised their voices. Black lives do matter. And because Black lives matter, the Black press matters. Black businesses matter. Black communities matter. And so in the context of Earth Day and Earth Month, all of our lives are precious.
I don't want us to sleep one thing before you go, and that is the importance of juries. We talk about, of course, the demonstrations and all that, but it was left up to those 12 jurors to make that decision. And in a lot of cases, even here in the District of Columbia, where the rule is no longer what actually happens, we are not being heard by a jury of our peers, because a lot of our peers don't want to serve on juries. But in this case, it just shows the importance not only of the jury, but the diversity of the jury as well. Yes. And do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, the jury was very important. We had African Americans as well as others. We had male and female. So the inclusiveness of the jury is very important, particularly here in the District of Columbia, but anywhere in the country. And I think you're right. Those jurors, it didn't take them long to reach the decision.
Right.
And that was because there was a predominance of evidence presented to the jury. But you're right. Sometimes, even when the evidence is in the favor of the African Americans, we don't get justice because we're not in the jury room. By being in the jury room, I'm glad you made that point, it makes a critical difference.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Chavis, I want to thank you so much for being with us. We have had a calamity of errors over here today. We will want to write about this segment of Win TV, but we're getting it done. And I appreciate your patience and for actually joining on with us. So, and I want people to remember, I want to give a shout out to you as well, because they can see you on the Chavis Chronicles, which is broadcast on PBS, as well as the morning show with Stacey Brown, that's on Facebook as well. Every morning, great programming. You're on as well. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. God bless.
All right. Thank you.